You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McCroy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to discuss autism, psi phenomena, and the gatekeepers of Scientism. It seems, folks, by popular demand here, I had a number of listeners ask me to look into a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. And tonight, I'm going to offer you some analysis of the Telepathy Tapes and give some plausible explanations to things, and offer a little more context into what it is that is related to this whole phenomenon going on. And certainly, there will be those that will dispute much of what I'm saying, much as they have this whole concept of the Telepathy Tapes podcast that has come out. If you're not familiar with this is a podcast that came out sometime, I believe, in September of 2024, and it arose very quickly on the podcast charts and got some mainstream attention. And the creator of this podcast series, her name is Ky Dickens, who is also an award-winning filmmaker. Well, she went on the Joe Rogan show, and everything kind of cascaded from there. Well, it seems to me, from my analysis, from having finally listened to the first 9 episodes of the Telepathy Tapes, I've come to the conclusion I do believe that Ky Dickens is very much sincere in her approach to this topic, and is sincerely running into all kinds of roadblocks in proceeding with this. Now, herself and the doctor she worked with primarily in the podcast series here, named Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell, both seem very sincere in their exploration of these topics, and Dr. Powell also is a member of some parapsychology network where she participates in some of these different occult studies. And I shouldn't necessarily say occult, it's more of a scientific approach which she takes, the parapsychological approach, which seems to have kind of fallen in its popularity over the course of the past 40 years or so. There's a real science behind parapsychology. There's a lot that needs to be understood, but you can't get all the answers that you're looking for by looking at this through the strictly observable scientific viewpoint that is our modern way of thinking. I more rightly call this scientism. That is the lens of observation that we use primarily in society and culture today. Our mainstream science is very much controlled from the top down by a select few research organizations and things of that nature who supply the money for these various interests. And it seems to me that the methodologies they use don't apply across the board 100%. Now, science is very useful for establishing objective, measurable facts. And things such as psi phenomena, as explained here, this is more of a subjective thing, and it is a lot harder to quantify in that sense. But certainly, we do have some of the older natural sciences and alchemical and occult sciences we could look at to explain some of this phenomena, and we will get into that tonight. But as I was saying, if you haven't listened to the Telepathy Tapes, and it seems to be that a vast majority of listeners of mine have probably listened to at least some of it to see what it's about. If you haven't done so, it is worth listening. It's a fascinating topic, and it touches all kinds of different subject matter that's really important in the era in which we're living. And of course, primary to this is this condition we know as autism. Now, autism is a spectrum disorder, as many of you have probably already heard and know, and the symptoms of autism range very much from individual to individual. Now, it seems to me the group that was more heavily focused on in this research and in this podcast were those who are considered to be very heavily affected by these autism spectrum disorders. These are the nonverbal people that are afflicted with this condition. So these nonverbal people seem to display some various traits that would fall under the psi phenomena category. So we're talking about parapsychology and these different types of things. And of course, It's primarily referred to by the creator of the podcast as telepathy. It's not 100% telepathy. From what my observation shows, it's not 100% telepathy. Now, there may be an element of telepathy involved in this. And we'll explore some of these avenues of thoughts as we go here through the program here tonight. But first, I wanted to comment on, once again, my take on all of this. I have some concerns about what's being presented in some regards, and in other regards, I do recognize there's a very real phenomenon going on with this, and there's a very real parapsychological or occult side to this happening. But my concerns aren't necessarily with the producers of the podcast themselves. It's about what the gatekeepers who influence all of this will have to say about this and have to do with this information. Now, this information that's coming out is kind of groundbreaking in many ways. It has been something that's been noticed by people, but hasn't been talked about in the circles of officialdom until now. And this is part of the problem. You see, the scientific establishment in the university system does not want to approach a topic like this because they can't fit it in their neat little box that they want to put it into. You see, they're trying to come up with all kinds of methodologies for analyzing this autism epidemic and coming up with perhaps treatments or different kinds of methods of helping with this, different kinds of supports to put in place. And all of this goes along with the normalization process of this as well. If you're familiar with my work, you know I've written 2 books on the autism epidemic and its connection to a little philosophy known as transhumanism. If you aren't familiar with the work I've done on this, I would highly suggest you check it out. It's eye-opening. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote it. I'm saying that because it's astounding what you find when you begin to delve down these roads into everything associated with the autism spectrum criteria that comes along. There's different things that go along with it that defy rational thinking and defy scientific methodology, and a lot of it has to do with the spiritual side of it and the occult science side of it, and that's what we're going to get into tonight. And this, for Ky Dickens, if you're listening or if somebody gets this podcast to her, I don't know if you're ready for some of these answers yet, but I can offer you some context into what it is that lies at the back of this phenomenon and why it is that the mainstream doesn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, and how it connects to various agendas in this world. And these are the people that you've encountered that you call gatekeepers. There's many of them. There are many gatekeepers out there trying to keep a lot of this information hidden. They don't want people to really consider these things on a serious level. And that's why I have seen so many negative reviews of your podcast, and they're calling it unscientific, and they're calling it pseudoscience and all of this stuff, and making different kinds of suggestions that these people were somehow prompted, and all of the different things. I see the criticism, and I can resonate with what you're feeling about that. I understand where you're coming from. I've been there. I've been called an ableist as well, so there's a lot of that goes on when you approach this topic. This is almost a taboo topic, and I have personally been affected by this topic, very much so. And it is a large portion of what led me down the path to do these things I'm doing today. But at any rate, gatekeepers. It's a very real problem, and they are out there. Joe Rogan is one such gatekeeper. I find it interesting that Rogan actually touched this, but you see what's happened since. Now, Rogan has been used as a mouthpiece to touch on all kinds of alternative topics, and most of the time the people walk away from that a little bit besmirched by the experience there. So we have a lot of gatekeeping goes on. Of course, the mainstream universities and the mainstream science and those who actually work within the system, they don't want to be considered to be unfit for dealing with these mental health issues. So they won't touch on anything that skirts around the spiritual side of things, or the occult side of things, or the parapsychological side of things that regards all of this stuff, even though it has been noticed and it has been reported by individuals for a very long time that it seems that some of these nonverbal autists oftentimes have some type of extrasensory perception of sorts. Now, this is something that has been hidden for a very long time. Studies of this sort have been considered by the university system and by mainstream science as being kind of taboo or nonsensical, or they've disproven this and disproven that. There's nothing to it. All the funding was cut for looking into this phenomenon because we didn't find anything useful out of it. Well, that's all nonsense. All of this has been compartmentalized into the military-industrial complex black budget programs. That's where much of the real serious research into psi phenomenon has gone. Just so people are aware. It's hidden behind non-disclosure agreements and behind corporate policies. You see, a lot of this is subcontracted out by the military-industrial complex to private corporations, because then you don't have to disclose it to Freedom of Information Act requests. This is how they've done things for the longest time within the auspices of this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. Well, the same thing holds true for much of this, for much psychical research. It's a real thing. It goes on at the highest, most echelons in this world, often done hidden behind the walls of private contractors with a military contract and non-disclosure agreements and compartmentalization galore. And all of this stuff goes on, and I would say look at Robert Bigelow as one example of such a thing. If you want real-world examples that you could look at and see what's happened. Now, all of this is hidden in the auspices of private corporation, and the research is done in secret on the lowdown. And we're not presented with much of what's gone on, and there have been top-secret intelligence agency projects that have looked into this. Look up the Stargate project from the CIA that happened in the 1980s. This is where the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats came from, out of this research. There were a lot of sub-projects under that, and of course the mainstream narrative behind that is, well, they didn't really establish anything that was useful out of that program, so the funding was cut and it's been discontinued. Poppycock. You can't tell me that they were getting real hits with the things they were doing, looking into remote viewing, and they cut the funding on that. Poppycock. That's absolute poppycock. They were getting real results from that Stargate program, from different compartmentalized programs beneath the Stargate program. They never stopped, just so you know. Where do you think all your money goes, where your tax dollars go that you can't seem to have accounted for? Those trillions of dollars that the Pentagon was missing, and is still missing, by the way. Trillions, you heard me right. Where did that money go? Well, it went into projects like this, programs like this. They know a little something more within the auspices of these programs about psychical phenomena than we know in the public sector. This is one of the ways they gatekeep this information. And they do have those in media who are also gatekeepers, who are given instructions. Okay, you could talk about this, but make sure you push the point of view that it's kind of nonsensical along with it. So we see a lot of that going on. I also find it intriguing that since the inception of this podcast and the putting out of this podcast, that the Telepathy Tapes has now signed with United Talent Agency. This is another gatekeeping organization, just so you are aware. You have to be careful. You want to play ball. I understand you want to reach as many listeners and as many ears as possible and as many minds as possible, and you try to play ball, but they're going to distort much of your findings and make them look nonsensical. That's what's going to happen here when you have people involved in the production of this that have some type of an influence or a marketing strategy for it. You're going to get more critical feedback. You're going to get a lot of negative feedback, is what I should say. It's okay to be critical. We all need to be critical. We all need to examine things with a critical eye and hold them up to scrutiny. The problem with that is, though, many of these gatekeeping organizations, whether they realize they're gatekeepers or not, they often attach a negative connotation to anything that goes against what the mainstream scientific paradigm would suggest. This goes across the board in all the various sciences, not just the biological or medical sciences or the psychology sciences and all of these things regarding all of this. So we have some popular notions of what is autism and what is the place of the autist in society. And there's a whole different type of level of assumption that goes into this diagnosis of autism, especially if you have somebody on the nonverbal side of autism, somebody that maybe has some quirky habits and things of this nature, somebody that seems disconnected from their body somehow. And there's a very real reason for that, and we're going to get into that. And a lot of this has to do with what they would call the metaphysical underpinnings of this. But these are the older sciences, the natural sciences, the alchemical sciences, the hermetic sciences, the occult sciences that most people have been conditioned to think of as absolute hokum and nonsense, when nothing could be further from the truth. You see, at the highest, most levels of this world, there are people that understand some of these older sciences and leverage them against the masses in various ways. Now, as I was alluding to, I don't know if Ky Dickens or Dr. Powell are ready to have this conversation, but there's a real agenda behind the promoting and pushing of autism, and there's a real agenda tied up in the silencing of anything associated with the spiritual component to it. This has been going on for a long time. As I said, I've written 2 books about the subject. I've done innumerable podcasts talking about the subject ad nauseum. You see, autism is a vehicle for these people. They use people on the autism spectrum as guinea pigs to experiment with new technologies and new sciences, new medical advancements. It's been going on for a long time. It's an engineered condition. Most people don't want to accept that. At bare minimum, it's been allowed to happen. Let's put it that way. To be politically correct about it. They've allowed it to persist. They know the mechanisms of action that cause the onset of autistic symptoms, but they are in denial about that, because to admit that, well, that would open a can of worms that the power structure is not equipped to deal with currently. But this has everything to do with a philosophy known as transhumanism. Most people are clueless about this. I don't know if the producers of the Telepathy Tapes have any unction whatsoever what transhumanism is or what it's about, or how it relates to autism, and how that relates to psi phenomena. But there are some connections to be made, and this has to do with our assumptions in the modern era about what we think we know about this world, and what those at the topmost levels of the power structure truly know about this world, about the old sciences, the things that we can know for sure about the nature of manifestation and the nature of consciousness itself. All of this is tied up in this topic, and this is why it is such a controversial topic, and they don't want you to touch it. They don't want you to touch it with a 10-foot pole. You don't want to try to connect autism to anything beyond that. They just want you to see it as a neurodivergent condition that has been with humanity for as long as time has been around, and it has been an important part of our evolution. These are the claims. They want you to see it as a positive. They want you to see it as something desirable, to have this diagnosis or these various traits associated with it. Now, there are some factors involved with autism that can be actually very positive. And I'm not trying to diminish the value of anybody on the autism spectrum, don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm about. I'm not demeaning or somehow dehumanizing people on the autism spectrum. Nothing could be further from the truth than that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to point out that this condition has been engineered into humanity. Autism can rightly be called the posthuman template. You see, transhumanism is about the evolution of man into his next state of being, an almost godlike state of being. It is what they refer to as self-guided evolution. It is the fulfillment of the great work of the old occult schools of thought. It is the Philosopher's Stone. It is the advent they're looking for. It's the old apotheosis, if you want to use the old word for it. It is man merging with his technology and becoming God. It's about building a neocortex for the human brain to connect man to the internet, to connect man to the internet of things, the internet of bodies. All of this stuff is going on. It's being established right now. And autism is one symptom of this. You see, it's a lot of these experimental technologies that have been implemented that have made this into an established condition. And why is that? Because the model of autistic intelligence is most compatible with artificial intelligence. So they're trying to engineer certain traits into the human being to establish parity to the artificial intelligence. They want to establish an artificially intelligent neocortex, an external neocortex, to the human brain that the human brain can access through some brain-computer interface device and create this sort of collective hive mind. Now, I know this sounds like nonsense from science fiction. You can find white papers talking about this. We've covered many of them in the past. This is a real thing going on at the highest, most echelons of military intelligence and the various organizations that work towards those goals. And you have some very real public faces for some of these things, like Elon Musk, who actively runs a company called Neuralink. Well, this is just a front organization showing you some potential usages for this. But the real developments are going on behind the scenes at other places and organizations where they have developed this beyond the capacity of what you could reasonably think about today, of what's been publicly disclosed. A lot of this stuff, like I said, is hidden in the black budget programs. It's in special access programs, that's what they are called, within the military-industrial complex, and they are a bare minimum of 30 to 50 years ahead of anything you see as state-of-the-art in the public domain. So they have already established many of these things. So what you see on the public stage, in the public domain right now, is actually bare minimum 30 years old. That's what that technology is. So, when you keep that in mind, you can only imagine some of the things they've been able to establish in the confines of these special access programs. And all of this interrelates with the subject matter here, because as I had alluded to earlier, there is a spiritual component to this, and it has to do with consciousness itself and manifestation in this reality, and those gatekeepers of the science of this world are attempting to access this link of causation from the spiritual realms here into the physical realm. And I know for anybody who's a first-time listener, this sounds like absolute utter nonsense. I assure you it is not nonsense. There's a lot to this. There's so much under the hood behind all of this that I'm only scratching the surface with this stuff. And I don't know if humanity at large is ready for this conversation yet. It seems to me they're not. But certainly, we need to address this, especially when you have a podcast like the Telepathy Tapes has reached many people now, and maybe many people are more open to thinking in this type of way. You see, you haven't been told everything there is to know about quote-unquote science, or about the nature of consciousness itself. Now, what it is that our mainstream science would like for us to believe about the nature of consciousness is the following. They would like very much for you to believe that this physical material world is all that there is, and all phenomena, consciousness inclusive, can be explained away through some physical cause and effect sequence. For example, they would like for you to believe consciousness is nothing more than the electrochemical byproduct of the brain and brainstem. Nothing could be further from the truth, though. But that is what they want you to believe, that consciousness is nothing more than the byproduct of some physical cause and effect sequence. Well, if that is the case, and that is true, and that's a big if, then, by proxy, all it would take to replicate your consciousness is an algorithm. So therefore, they could duplicate your consciousness via algorithm in a machine, and you could live forever in some type of a digital existence through a computer program in various containers that you would like. This is the promise of transhumanism. They want you to think that they could conquer all illness, death inclusive, through the use of these transhumanist technologies, and a lot of it has to do with uploading your consciousness into a machine. This is the angle they're going with. Now, like I said, autism relates to this in one particular way. The models that they have of autistic intelligence most closely match artificial intelligence. Therefore, it's about parity with the machine. It's about making the human being on par to be merged with the machine, with the computer, connecting the brain to the rest of this electronic neocortex in the cloud. That's what it's about. Now, what does this have to do with psychical phenomena of various sorts? Well, stick around. We're going to discuss some of that. And we're going to offer some plausible explanations as to the things that the Telepathy Tapes has actually observed and seen. One of the tools that they use to make some of these observations in the Telepathy Tapes projects is a facilitated communication using a type of a keyboard so that the autist could type words into a computer and have this computer read it off as speech, or give the actual expression of what it is that they're thinking about, or what it is that they are observing. Now, this is one of the things that has come under scrutiny by the mainstream. They say that this facilitated communication has long been discredited, when in actuality it really hasn't. But they would like to propose that it has. Now, this brings to mind a couple concerning things. Now, first of all, if this is a legitimate form of communication for those that are nonverbal, why are we not giving them the opportunity en masse to use this to communicate better? Now, a lot of this has to do with individual agency. You see, they don't want people to believe that nonverbal autists have any type of competence in their decision-making abilities. Now, there are several factors in play with this, and some have some more serious conditions and symptoms than others, and many of these are hard to manage for various reasons. But they assume incompetence or the lack of competence in these individuals in their decision-making abilities and in their ways in which they could communicate and express themselves because they are nonverbal. Now, because it doesn't fall into the normal paradigm of communication in the human being as a neurotypical human being, they disregard this, and they view these people as somehow not having that competence to communicate, and that the use of this facilitated communication using the keyboard to type out what it is they want to express is just some type of an anomaly based upon the inputs of the parent or the caretaker. Now, sometimes it seems that many on the autism spectrum, those who are more severely affected and are nonverbal, oftentimes have troubles with fine motor skills and things of that sort. So sometimes they are given help from the facilitator to type the various keys, but many times what happens over the course of time with training with this is they will eventually begin to type on their own. And that's all part and parcel of some of the things that have been observed, and these have been talked about on the telepathy tapes. But certainly, this in and of itself becomes problematic, because you'll have the scientific mainstream saying, well, clearly the parent typed that for them, or it's wishful thinking on their part, or somehow they were prompted to do this, or to type this, or to say this thing, or it's the parents or the caretakers' wishful thinking that maybe made these connections for them to facilitate this communication in this way. So that's why they will try to discredit all of this. They say it's not accurate under scientific scrutiny. Now you have people who will swear up and down that these people, these autists who suffer from these debilitating conditions and are nonverbal, can communicate through this facilitated communication technique with the use of keyboards and things like that, where they can express their thoughts and feelings. And this could be a very useful and helpful thing for those who suffer with these conditions. But largely, a lot of this has been pushed to the back burner by the mainstream, who actually deal with people on the autism spectrum on a daily basis. They'll say that this facilitated communication has largely been discredited, and they don't bother with it because they don't think there's any merit to it. But at the same time, they will often also recognize that very many times technologies do help these people to communicate and to function a little better. And they have computer programs and different things that they can use to help those who suffer from these extreme or severe versions of autism to learn more readily. So they will rightly acknowledge that, yes, sometimes the technology can help, but no, this facilitated communication thing with the keyboard is just way out there in left field. And that's the whole modus operandi they go with this. So they will say that this form of communication is invalid, that it's trickery and nothing more, or wishful thinking and nothing more. So that's how they carte blanche dismiss all of this. Now, some of the other things you see that it would appear that those who use this facilitated communication, those on the spectrum, these nonverbal folks, they're able to somehow interpret things going on around them without having direct physical sight of that. They'll identify objects or colors or various things that are going on perhaps in another room through this facilitated communication, or that is happening to somebody else, and the claim has been made that sometimes it seems they could read the minds of their caretakers and other people, and that they can somehow know things or see through the other person's eyes and know things that they shouldn't know. And this has all been facilitated with this communication technique using the keyboards. So the whole premise of it falls back on that. So is that valid or not? Of course, the scientific mainstream will say there's nothing valid to it, and they'll dismiss it out of hand. But when you actually observe some of this stuff happening, you see there's no way that they could fake this. And you have to wonder what's going on. Why is it that these nonverbal people seem to have these abilities, these psi phenomena abilities, sort of psychic abilities? Psychical research has been done on a lot of this stuff and has shown some merit in the past, but certainly they haven't ever applied it to this population of people until now. And now they're really trying to take a good look at it, but the gatekeepers get in the way. They don't want people to take this seriously. It's kind of like I hate to use the comparison, but if you've ever heard of locked-in syndrome, it seems to me that that's something similar that goes on with a lot of these nonverbal autists. They're present, they have limited control over their physical bodies, and they don't have the capacity to communicate via speech like a neurotypical person does, and therefore, oftentimes, what's going on within their inner life is misinterpreted or ignored altogether, and they are dealt with in a way that is sort of demeaning and dehumanizing. It takes away an aspect of their competence. And they are seen oftentimes in this way. Now, I think perhaps the people involved in the study on the telepathy tapes may not be an overall view of the entirety of the situation of this population, but it is a subset of the population, and some of the things that they had established relative to this small group that they looked at, it's kind of incomprehensible to think that a lot of the things that they've said and described are coincidence. Now, I'm referring in general here, and if you haven't listened to the telepathy tapes, in order to have a better understanding of the things I'm talking about, I think you would benefit from listening to it. But they established through the communications of several of these nonverbal autists that somehow or another, psychically, these autists would meet. And they would be able to communicate and talk with one another, and they had friendships that were often many miles away. And they would meet in this strange type of a realm that they called the Hill. Now this, in and of itself, offers a really unique perspective into things. And this is wherein I think we can establish perhaps some explanation as to why it is these people have these psi abilities, and why it is that they could communicate using this facilitated communication, and why it is the gatekeepers don't want that to come out. Now, I know this is a lot, and to a first-time listener, this probably sounds like total hokum and nonsense, and I get that. I'm not afraid of the backlash. The things I've talked about here in the past, most people are not comfortable with. They're not ready for that conversation. But we're going to touch on it here because it's important. And it is something that is established in the old occult literature. So we're going to offer some explanations as to what could be at the backside of this psi phenomenon that is expressed and shown through these nonverbal autists. Now, this is controversial, and I get that, and many people may take umbrage with this. But in order to establish a proper explanation of how and why this is happening, we need to lay down some criteria that doesn't align with the mainstream narrative of all of it, doesn't align with the mainstream scientific way of thinking, but most certainly this has been established in other times, in other sciences of the past, and it has to do with the nature of consciousness itself and what it is that man truly is and how he expresses himself and how he manifests here in this world. And all of this falls back to the occult sciences, and we'll take a look at the Rosicrucian perspective of this to better understand. Now, let's lay down some foundations. According to the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, man exists simultaneously in various different vehicles, as they call it. The physical body is only one such vehicle. Attached directly to the physical body is a sub-portion of the physical plane called the etheric, and therefore attached to the physical body of man is the etheric body of man. Directly attached to the physical. Now, attached to this etheric body of man is the astral body of man. And to this astral body of man is the causative body of man, or the mental body of man. So you have this connection back through these various planes of existence as offered by the Rosicrucians, and it's a very different way of thinking than our modern cosmology and our modern science would have us think. Now, the etheric is finer in its subtlety than the physical, and the astral is finer in its subtlety than the etheric, and is actually a different plane of existence altogether. The etheric is a subplane of the physical plane. Now, you have to really have a background in understanding some of these occult concepts and sciences to really appreciate what I'm putting on display here and offering here. And it takes many years of study to really come to a firm understanding of all of it. But I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version as best I can. So we have all of these various vehicles that interpenetrate one another, coexist at the same time in these different layers or planes of existence, if you want to put it that way, spheres of existence. They're spheres as called by the Rosicrucians and some of the other occult systems. So our body is interpenetrated by this etheric body, which is in turn interpenetrated by the astral body, which is in turn penetrated by the causal body, also known as the mental body. It comes from the mental plane, or the devacanic plane, according to the Rosicrucian description. So all of these things exist simultaneously within man, and he has these various vehicles for expression. Now, the physical that we're familiar with, the Rosicrucians call this the dense chemical region of physicality. The etheric is a finer material. It is a subplane of the physical plane. And the etheric version of that is finer in its attributes. So you could think of the physical attributes we have here, the physical states of matter. There's solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and according to the Rosicrucians, there's 3 more layers of that in the etheric portion, above plasma. And this is where the etheric rests. So the etheric body is attached directly to the physical body, and it's also connected and attached directly to the astral body, which transcends this plane of existence. And they claim at night, when you go to sleep, that your astral body separates from your physical and etheric vehicles and is free to float about, and it has experiences that you won't remember because it is not imprinted into the physical brain. Now, these are the claims of the Rosicrucians. This is not something I'm making up or something I'm making up and claiming to be true. These are some of the occult teachings as we see them. So what happens in your regular human being is all of these vehicles are very tightly attached one to another. The etheric is tightly attached to the physical, and it is kind of a transitional vehicle between the physical body and the astral body. So this etheric body is a connecting point. Now, they're all very tightly connected one to another. Now, what I'm offering here is an explanation as to some of the plausible reasons why some of these nonverbal autists seem to have this psychical phenomena surrounding them is because of what I'm about to tell you next. You see, the Rosicrucians, and not just the Rosicrucians, you'll find this in all the other different occult fraternities and systems out there in the world. They explain that central to human consciousness, there is a little black dot that they claim clairvoyants can see when they look at the auras of people and they look into these other realms. You see, at an area they call the root of the nose, there sits in the pituitary body of man a gland called the pineal gland. And this is central to what I'm speaking of here. Now, in the astral and the other planar existences that clairvoyants claim to be able to see, they can see this black dot, this impenetrable black dot, through all the different vehicles of man, whether it be physical, etheric, astral, or devacanic. They can see this black dot. This is what they call the Holy of Holies. This is the seat of consciousness. This is an impenetrable seat of consciousness that resides within man, and it can't be violated. This is the ontological self. This is the I am within man. This is how they describe it. And this black point aligns perfectly in the physical with the pineal gland in man. And this is, of course, known as the third eye in many of the occult systems. And that being the case, it also aligns in normal circumstances with these other bodies or vehicles of man, the etheric, the astral, the devacanic? Well, according to many within the secret schools themselves, and we'll go ahead and we'll name Rudolf Steiner as one in particular who talked about this, there are certain things that can happen to a person, traumatic events that can affect a person, and that could cause the loosening, the sudden loosening of the etheric body of man from the physical vehicle. And what happens is this etheric vehicle, this etheric body, becomes misaligned with the physical body. And by proxy, what this does is this causes the astral body to become misaligned with the physical body as well, and it becomes much looser and more free roaming, and actually gives sensations in the astral realm as to things going on that are perceivable in the physical consciousness of man. So it would kind of be almost as if your center of consciousness was not in your brain, as most people perceive it. But in this regard, it would be sitting right above the head and outside of the physical head. And this is how you would perceive the reality around you. Now, according to the Rosicrucians, there are certain animals in the animal kingdom who this spot, this seat of individuation, sits outside of the physical body within, and they claim horses are one particular animal wherein this happens. So therefore, this is why certain animals perceive things humans don't, and they become very readily spooked, because their etheric form is not perfectly aligned with their physical form, and therefore that seat of consciousness sits just outside of the physical body and vehicle, and therefore they perceive things that we don't. This is according to the Rosicrucians. Like I said, I am not making this stuff up. This is all recorded in much of the occult literature, and you can find all of this stuff if you do a diligent search. So what happens is some type of physical trauma can shake loose this etheric vehicle, this etheric body from the physical, and could misalign it so that you can perceive things outside your physical body. And your astral vehicle can travel much more freely in waking consciousness than what is possible otherwise. And this gives a plausible explanation as to what it is that these nonverbal autists experience, and how it is that they could claim to meet some of their friends at certain times on what they call the hill, and have conversations and hang out and stuff like that, and have interactions outside of their physical body. This is one of the plausible explanations. Like I said, I don't know, Ky Dickens, if you are ready for this conversation or not. But this seems to me what is happening here. Now, of course, the scientific community will deny this, and do everything to push back against this way of thinking, because they don't want you to understand any of the old alchemical sciences or the old natural sciences. There are gatekeepers at the topmost levels of this world that keep many of these concepts hidden from the masses, because there's a greater agenda at play, and it has everything to do with the spiritual side of this reality. So I hope we can garner some insight from what's been revealed here thus far. So this offers plausible explanation. This notion of the Holy of Holies, as they call it, the Sanctum Sanctorum, this black indescribable dot that the clairvoyants claim to be able to see, that interpenetrates all the various vehicles of man, when it's misaligned with the physical body, it can manifest as different types of psychical phenomena within the person. And I think that's what's being expressed there. And of course, they don't want any of this to get out to the public. They would like very much for all of this to be denied outright, or for it to be thought of as silly and nonsensical and all of these different things, and they would rather claim that these people have no competence, they aren't competent, and that this is just the wishful thinking of the parents, and this is just the wishful thinking of the caretakers, and this is just whatever explanation they give after explanation. It's unscientific, it's unfounded, it's this, it's that. Well, I do have some concerns about the communication technique that facilitated communication through the computer, because this, of course, leads to some other tenets of the research I've done in the past. They fully intend for brain-computer interface devices to be the ultimate cure for autism. Now, Elon Musk came out and said such a thing. He said, and I predicted he would say this months before he actually said it, and it's documented in my book, The Autism Epidemic, Transhumanism's Dirty Little Secret. I predicted in that book that he would say this very thing, and several months later, almost a year later, he came out on a podcast and said he thinks his Neuralink device can, quote-unquote, solve autism. I made that prediction. I was correct. He did say that. That's always been one of the goals, and of course, they will look at things like Alzheimer's and everything else as well, because it's all related. You see, it's all related. Schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder, all of these conditions that afflict 1 in 5 people in this world right now. 1 in 5. All of these things are part and parcel of the experimentation that's gone on into the nature of consciousness and the attempt to tie mankind to the Internet of Things, which has been going on for a lot longer than most people are comfortable with accepting. And it all has to do with this notion of transhumanism. It's all connected, it's all related. So what are we talking about here? You heard me express that it is acknowledged by those in the secret schools, and I quoted Rudolf Steiner, particularly, I know for a fact he said this, that some type of a trauma, a physical trauma, can cause this shaking loose of the etheric body from the physical. Well, what can cause such a thing? Well, what would you say if I told you that there are certain substances that they put in childhood vaccines that can cause a traumatic injury to the brain and potentially shake loose the etheric vehicle from man in that way through that trauma? What would you say if I were to tell you that? Are you ready for that conversation? Are people ready for that? And this crosses the bounds and the lines of just the strictly physical material world paradigm. You see, the experimentation they've been performing on people, especially those on the autism spectrum, for the longest time now, they cross the bounds of what the accepted material science has to say. At the highest, most levels of control and power in this world, there are those who understand some of these spiritual sciences, some of the soul sciences as they've been described by Rudolf Steiner and others, by the Rosicrucians, by the older occult fraternities. All of these things known for the longest time, the old natural sciences, they understand them. And they understand the nature of manifestation, how the causative worlds are the spiritual worlds. And that causation in the physical material world we live in actually first is performed in the spiritual, and it steps down through the etheric into manifestation in the physical. Well, what if I told you they're trying to hijack that process of manifestation? Are you all ready for this conversation yet? That's the big question. Are you ready for that conversation? Do you realize how deep the science of control runs? How they have established mind control techniques from the earliest of times, and they've used advanced technologies to further implement those techniques in ways that we scarcely could dream of. Do you realize what it is they're trying to do? They're trying to hijack the seat of consciousness. This inviolable, impenetrable seat of consciousness. The Holy of Holies. The ontological self, the I am within man. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to violate that in opposition to natural law. You see, we exist in a system wherein there are certain inviolable natural laws in place that are there for a reason, that our Creator made for a reason and implemented for a reason. They're trying to violate those natural laws by actually tampering with the ontological self, the I am within man. I hope this is making sense to you. I hope maybe you're ready to have this conversation. It is something that does need to be considered and taken seriously, although most will probably laugh it off. Say, Wayne has finally gone and lost his mind completely. No. I have spent the better part of my adult life reverse engineering this. There is evidence that this is the nature of what's going on, and we're seeing a lot of it coming into play, having real world effects here in our world today. And we're seeing this push ever further, ever closer to this transhumanist notion of things, and that's where it ultimately will find its representation by those who control this world if they have their way. And there's a spiritual component to it. You see, the ultimate goal is to completely separate man from all spiritual concerns. And I think a lot of people are finally beginning to understand this and come to terms with this. And we're beginning to see evidences of this, and we're beginning to see symptoms of this. And one of the primary places we could see symptoms of all of this is in the autistic community. Now, like I said, many people will take umbrage with the things I'm saying here tonight. That's okay. I don't mind being criticized for the things and the ideas I'm presenting, because truth doesn't need justification. Truth will stand on its own. And maybe, just maybe, I got some stuff wrong, and if I do, I'll readily come out and admit I was wrong. I don't have any compunction with doing that. I would love to be wrong about all of this stuff, I'll be honest with you. I don't take delight in being correct in the things I'm saying. That doesn't give me any comfort. But we need to be aware of the true machinations of things going on in this world, and we need to be aware of why it is people won't touch topics like this with a 10-foot pole. I'm not afraid to speak up. You see, autism has affected me in a very personal way. And I have seen the sides of this that are the sides that aren't very pretty, the ugly sides. I've seen it from all different angles. I'm affected by it on all different angles. And I understand that we need to have hope for a better understanding of what's going on in a way to maybe make things better in regards to those afflicted with this condition. And I'll try to be careful with my language because my intention is not to offend anybody. But the reality is, autism is a disability, despite the best efforts of the social engineers of this world to present it as anything but. It is a disability. It does have a very real effect on the lives of those afflicted with it. And it's not always sunshine and roses, as so many like to portray it. It's not always, oh, that's just that quirky guy with a little bit of social awkwardness, with the affinity for computers and technology and things like that, the one who has difficulty expressing his emotions. It goes way deeper than that. And there are different levels on the autism spectrum where different things have set in, and I find the data that's come out recently interesting, because the data that I've looked at and that I've compiled through the years since the writing of my first book about autism has changed significantly. Now, between the years of 2019, when I published my first book on autism, and 2023, when I published my second book on autism, the numbers had skyrocketed. At the time of writing of the 2019 book, the percentage of those on the autism spectrum with average or higher intelligence was 44%. Did you know that? That is a fact established by the CDC and other places. You can look that up if you'd like. That was as of 2019. As of 2023, the percentage of those on the autism spectrum with average or above intelligence was 59%. That's conservatively a 15% uptick in those on the spectrum with higher intelligence, those that were less severely affected by the symptoms of autism. This goes beyond statistical probability to say that this is a coincidence. This evidence, in my view, clearly demonstrates that there's a type of engineering of this condition that has been going on. Now, here's the interesting part of this. Since that time, just earlier this year, they released some new data on this, showing that the percentage and the levels of those severely affected have now increased, whereas the trend since I was putting together the first book had shown a decrease in those severely affected and an increase of those on the higher levels of the spectrum, the higher intelligence levels of the spectrum, those less severely affected. This is reversed. Something's going on. Something's going on. Now, the suggestion, because of the disparity, the difference in the percentages between 2019 and 2023, showed me that this goes beyond statistical probability, that there was that much of an increase in those on the higher intelligence strata of the spectrum. So that suggests engineering. Well, now, since then, the numbers have significantly dropped on those with average or above intelligence on the spectrum, and those that are more severely affected have taken precedence. Something's changed. They've had some type of physiological trauma that's different now than it was those prior years, and it's causing these more severe effects on their physical bodies. Well, that demonstrates to me there's something new that they put into the mix. Something new has emerged that may have a causative influence in all of this, and we're beginning to see it. This, in my view, is part and parcel of experimentation going on. Perhaps they realized that by using certain materials, they could induce this prospect of the separation or the shaking loose of the etheric body from the physical body. And I think that's what's being studied in regards to this. That's my viewpoint, that's my opinion, and I reserve the right to be totally wrong on all of it. But it seems a little too coincidental to me that all of a sudden there's a shift in the other direction with this, and this might be something that they're experimenting with in order to see how close they could get to being able to totally influence human consciousness in very many ways, to maybe shake loose this seat of individuation within man, the Holy of Holies, the Sanctum Sanctorum, the I Am. And it seems to me that perhaps there's something deeper going on with this. They're collecting data on the back end of all of this. That's what this has always been about. They're collecting data on the back end of all of this, and they're putting it in a centralized utility. They've used a repository called the National Database for Autism Research in order to collect the data on the back end of all of this experimentation that's been going on. Now, of course, they won't admit to experimentation. They'll just say it's to help researchers to figure out the causes of autism and potential treatments and all of these different variables associated with that. Now, since then, they've also been putting together larger databases modeled on this NDAR system to collect all kinds of genomic information from people the world around. They're collecting all of this data for a reason, and they're putting it into a centralized utility for a reason. And they use those on the autism spectrum as guinea pigs for this experimentation. But of course, they won't admit to experimentation. Like I said, it's all about just trying to understand this condition so that we can find maybe some treatment protocols for it. And you'll notice they'll never say anything about a cure for autism. They don't want to cure autism. There's a very real reason for that. They've come up with a whole social engineering campaign of autism acceptance. It goes beyond autism awareness. It's now become autism acceptance. And they've even come up with new monikers to describe it. They call it neurodivergence. I'm neurodivergent. How many people have you heard describing themselves that way? And now you have people who are out there diagnosing themselves based upon some of these criteria that establish some of the more common traits within autism. And it's become a whole social engineering trope unto itself. So now we have all of this kind of stuff going on. We have the normalization process of it. We have no intention to cure autism. We have no intention to actually solve autism, aside from the introduction of a somewhat invasive brain-computer interface device to attach your neocortex to the external neocortex of the machine, of the Internet of Bodies. That's a real thing. The Internet of Things. And an upcoming subsystem of the Internet of Things that's being developed. And like I said, this is not all conjecture. This is not me making stuff up. These are real facts that are talked about out there in white papers across the board. Well, there's a subset of the Internet of Things, a subsystem that they're developing called the Internet of Thoughts. And that is one of the concerning aspects of all of this. And this, in and of itself, gives me pause to consider what's been revealed in the telepathy tapes, where you have these nonverbal people claiming that they can meet their friends on the hill, as they call it, and they hang out there, communicate, and have a grand old time, and are able to talk and interact with one another. And this may be a real phenomena associated with the astral body being able to more freely travel while the physical body is conscious. And maybe there's a real phenomenon there. Or maybe, and here's the big if, and I think maybe that is the case, what I just described there, that is what's happening. Well, it seems to me they want to try to duplicate this process, because what they are in fact doing is trying to build an artificial, a synthetic, etheric portion of this reality, wherein they tie this whole concept of metaverse to that, the digital realm, the digital sub-layer of our reality, wherein they want to tie the minds of men into the greater computer system, the control grid from cradle to grave, and perhaps duplicate some such experience in that way. And this is where I find concerns in these various communication techniques that are being used in this way, this facilitated communication via the keyboard, the computer interface. Well, what this will eventually morph into, and this is what I am concerned with, is eventually, if this gets proven to be a factual thing, and maybe the Telepathy Tapes podcast is one way in which this can be done, if this proves to be actually something with real merit, that these people can communicate through this device, through the use of a technology, the next step is a more invasive form of this technology where it will read their thoughts directly and put that into communication in that way, which further ties them into the computer grid, ties them to the technological side of things. And the problem with it is any such device, a brain-computer interface, a BCI device, this is a two-way system. It's not a one-way thing, as they might have you believe, wherein your brain can actually communicate and function with the external computer in that way. Well, the computer also communicates with the brain. So this is a way in which a false narrative can be actually fed into the communication system to the actual person that's hooked to this in this more invasive way. This is where I find concern with it. It's all about attaching human consciousness to this greater control grid, to this machine. That's what the whole artificial intelligence push is about. That's what the whole transhumanist push is all about. That's why you have people like Elon Musk, who came out years ago and said, well, if artificial intelligence gets developed, it could get to a point where it's dangerous and it turns on mankind and destroys us all. So our only hope for surviving such an advent is to actually merge with the artificial intelligence. This is most certainly the plan. This is what is at the core of transhumanism. And my fear is that they intend to use the autistic population as the guinea pigs for the initial rollout of this. And that perhaps this may be one of the things that's being leveraged here. You see, those people in the highest, most levels of power in this world, they play a very different game than the rest of us. They play it at a high level, and they're always steps ahead with their ways of thinking. And they know that humanity's on the brink of a spiritual awakening here. They know that people are beginning to wake up to the corruption and the nonsense that's gone on and the lies that permeate our reality. They know man is hungry for something spiritual. And they also know that this autism epidemic, and make no mistakes about it, it is an epidemic. They're talking 1 in 32, I think is the number now. It is an epidemic. They know that people are looking for answers or solutions to this problem, and maybe this will be their way to solve the problem. Maybe they'll acknowledge, okay, there is somebody in there. There is a consciousness in there. There is a capable person in there. And it's only because of this weird physiological condition they have going on that limits their ability to communicate properly and adequately as to what their thoughts and desires and feelings are. So we can solve that with technology, and we will use this technology to help them facilitate that change in themselves. And in reality, is it really the goal to do that? Will it work? And what's the other flip side of the coin with that? Because like I said, all of these devices, these technologies, are a two-way communication device. A BCI device has inputs and outputs, and all of this ties back to the science of cybernetics. It all links together. Science, occultism, the medical conditions we see happening in this world, it's all linked together. There is an agenda at play. It is the big granddaddy of all conspiracies going on today. It's called transhumanism. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. And then you'll begin to understand our reality on a whole different level. But as I have stated, I don't think most people are ready for this conversation yet. How autism ties into this transhumanist ideology and how it has its roots in the occult. I know, if anybody's been a listener for a long time, I sound like a broken record. It always invariably ends in two places. As far back as you look, you always find the occult. And as far forward as you look, you always find transhumanism. They are inseparable. This is what's going on in the world. It is the big granddaddy of all conspiracies in the world, and any conspiratorial type of a topic that you decide to research, you will always find these two things inherent within it, because it is the end goal, and it is the plan that's been in place from time immemorial. You'll always find the occult, and you'll always find transhumanism. They are ever present. As much as I would like that to not be the case, it's always, always, always there. And I would invite anybody to prove otherwise, because you won't be able to. You will always find it, no matter where you look. It's what's going on in the world. It is what the controllers at the highest, most levels of this place want. They want this transhumanist future, and there are many different facets of it that deserve scrutiny. But we're not going to get into that here, because the whole primary purpose of tonight's episode is to touch on these topics, such as autism, psi phenomena, the gatekeepers of scientism. Science, in and of itself, is a problematic thing, because where the money is where the science lies. That will tell you everything you need to know. Whoever funds a study will get the results they want from that study. Invariably, that's how it works. You want to keep getting a paycheck, you will produce the science that the benefactor wants. That's how it works. The scientific peer-reviewed journals are a major joke at this point. Most people aren't ready to accept that yet. It's always been this old boys network, even within that. In the auspices of academia, that's always been the way. It's a bunch of people up there patting each other on the back and saying, oh, well, this is very good because this aligns with everything that I'm trying to tell you, rather than applying any scrutiny to it. The peer review process is broken. The establishment of the scientific method has been broken. They accept very many things that can't be proven by scientific method and call it science at this point. But it does become the consensus, and consensus is not reality, folks. And that's the problem. They don't want to look at these things that don't fit neatly into their little paradigm. It's all about the denialism of the spiritual component. It's all about the denialism of anything beyond this physical material world. And it's all by design. There's so many angles to all of this that require scrutiny and thought. I'm here to incite thought. That's my job. I don't want to tell you what to think or what to believe. That's not my place. What I will do is I'll present to you the material and allow you to come to your own conclusions with it. But by and large, I wanted to offer you my take on what it is I think is going on with the telepathy tapes, and I think there is a basis of truth to what has been uncovered. And I think there's a lot of gatekeeping that's gone on to kind of silence the whole thing, but at the same time to also give it mainstream exposure so that later on that could be weaponized in the utilization of new technologies to put things back on course for the transhumanist singularity. Of course, in order to understand a lot of this, you have to go back to the occult sciences to understand what's going on, and of course, mainstream academia won't touch that with a 10-foot pole, but I assure you, you can find all of these things that I was talking about. They are expressed in very, very, very many places throughout the various occult fraternities and systems. You can find all of this. Now, I highly recommend the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception to give you a broad overview of many of these things. But I think this basic understanding is what is lacking in the analysis of what's been presented in the telepathy tapes. That's my take, that's my opinion on all of this. I think that the creator of the telepathy tapes is sincere in her seeking after answers on this, finding all kinds of opposition in the way of trying to come to terms with what has been observed, and not having a base understanding of what's really there. That's what happens when you get caught up in this scientific worldview that we have been firmly ensconced in for a very long time. We've been indoctrinated into thinking in this way, whereas the only thing you accept as true is something that could be objectively weighed, measured, or quantified. And this quantification of things is what their modus operandi is across the board. They want to weigh, measure, and quantify everything, because here's the reason why. If you can quantify a thing, that gives you some measure of control over that thing. So even those subjective things that we look at, they will still attempt to quantify in some way, shape, or form, because it gives you a mathematical formula you could work with to establish some type of control over that thing. Even if it's an imprecise measure of control, it still gives you some type of a way to leverage that. So they apply this across the board to everything, and they try to apply it across the board to these spiritual or subjective types of phenomena as well. And that's what this is about. It's about keeping close tabs on this. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Now, if through this exposure of this phenomenon within the autistic community, people begin to learn that there is a spiritual side to things and begin to explore those ways of thinking, when they begin to establish the fact that there is a spiritual component in this world, there are other things beyond this realm that exist that they can't gatekeep as well anymore if this information comes out. And that creates a problem for them. Therefore, they will do their utmost to keep the lid firmly down tight on all of this stuff. Try to make it sound ridiculous, nonsensical. They'll call it pseudoscience. They'll call it misinformation, disinformation. They'll call it superstitious nonsense. They'll call it mythology. They'll call it storybook nonsense. They'll call it every derogatory thing they can, because they don't want people to look down those lines of thinking. They don't want people to think in terms of the spiritual, the subjective. To think that there's something beyond this realm that we live in. Something beyond the material, physical world. They don't want people to ask the important questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What's the point in all of this? You see, all of those are spiritual yearnings within man. They don't want us to seek after that. They would prefer us to seek after the physical in place of that. And that's what they're trying to steer and manufacture in this reality. And therefore, something like this would cause people to question the paradigm. And they don't want questioners, they want followers. They want obedience. They want you to shut up and line up for your next booster shot. And that's the other uncomfortable truth behind all of it. All of this is a massive eugenics program as well. That's another angle to it. And the things they're doing to the autistic population are giving them data to perform this massive eugenics operation on the masses. That's what transhumanism truly is. Pro-transhumanists have described it as, quote-unquote, eugenics without coercion. They tell you who they are and what they're about in no uncertain terms. It's just most people don't listen. People don't want their worldview shaken. They don't like to look outside their normalcy bias. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's a very real phenomenon. People don't want to accept uncomfortable truths. They would rather believe comforting lies. That lies at the heart of everything going on in society and culture at large today. People don't look under the hood to see what's really going on. They just accept the surface-level facade of everything that's presented to them as the truth. People don't want to talk about this stuff, or even consider the possibility. I just ask you, consider the possibility. Now, I could be wrong on all of this. The preponderance of evidence says otherwise, though, but I do reserve the right to be wrong, and I would be extremely happy to be totally wrong about all of this, but this seems to be the direction this all goes. We need to be wary moving forward. I do look forward to listening to the second season of the Telepathy Tapes to see what else is talked about and explored in that season, if they touch on any of the things that I had just spoken about. Only time will tell. I suspect that perhaps the occult side of things will be explored. I hope so, because it's necessary for understanding this. If you truly want answers or explanations for what it is that you've seen and observed and witnessed, then you need to go down those paths in order to find the truth. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. And that doesn't do anybody any bit of good. So at any rate, that's my 2 cents for what it's worth. In regards to this, there are those in this world that would prefer to keep information like this on the down low. And there are those in this world that would very much like to explore these avenues of thought, but they run into roadblocks every which way that they turn. Especially when it comes to a sensitive topic like autism. Anyway, folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'll remind you that I appreciate each and every one of you. That is all the time we have for tonight. Have a good night now.